The first thing anyone notices about living in a tipi at -30 degrees is the contrast between the violent cold outside and the quiet, almost alive warmth within. The frozen plains stretch endlessly, their white surfaces reflecting an unforgiving sun that feels distant and weak. Wind cuts like a blade, and snow drifts pile high, shaped by gusts that whistle through every crack in the earth, carrying temperatures that can freeze exposed skin in minutes. To survive here, humans had to adapt not only their bodies, but their thinking, their routines, and the very structures they called home. The tipi, deceptively simple in appearance, was a marvel of design born from generations of observation, experimentation, and quiet wisdom. From the outside, a tipi might appear as a fragile cone of animal hides stretched over wooden poles. To a modern eye, it seems temporary, vulnerable to storms, snow, and wind, but this simplicity masks a highly sophisticated system. Every component, the poles, the hides, the smoke flaps, the liner, was chosen and arranged for maximum efficiency in cold survival. The conical shape was critical. It directed snow and wind downward, preventing dangerous accumulation, and allowed the interior heat to circulate naturally. Unlike rigid structures, it flexed with gusts, bending slightly rather than resisting, reducing the likelihood of structural failure. It was a living design, responding to the environment as much as the people inside it. The poles themselves were far from random sticks of wood. They were carefully selected from the strongest, most resilient trees, often willow, lodgepole pine, or cedar, depending on the region. Each pole had a slight curve, allowing it to bend without breaking, giving tipi flexibility that a rigid frame could never achieve. The poles were tied at the top in a precise triangular knot, forming a stable apex that could support the weight of the stretched hides and the pressure of heavy snow. Even the angle at which the poles were placed mattered. Too steep, and heat escaped too quickly; too shallow, and snow could accumulate dangerously. This balance of geometry and material knowledge was perfected over generations, refined not through books but through direct experience, trial and error in extreme conditions. Hides were chosen for more than insulation. They were a complete system for regulating warmth. Buffalo hides were prized, their dense hair providing unmatched thermal protection. Deer, elk, or antelope hides were also used in layers, sometimes sewn together with sinew with trapped air pockets for insulation. The orientation of the fur mattered. The hairs were positioned outward on outer layers to break wind, and inward on inner layers to retain body heat. Overlapping hides created zones of warmth and air pockets, a primitive yet highly effective form of thermal engineering. Every stitch, every seam, every overlap was intentional, designed to maintain warmth while allowing moisture to escape. The tiniest oversight could result in drafts or frost forming inside the living space. The smoke hole was another brilliant feature. At first glance, it seemed nothing more than an opening at the apex, but it was carefully engineered. The fire of the center of the tipi generated rising heat and smoke. Without a smoke hole, the interior would quickly fill with smoke, suffocating its inhabitants. Yet an open hole in a -30-degree environment could also allow deadly drafts. The solution was a movable flap system. Long poles allowed occupants to adjust the flaps from inside, responding to shifts in wind or pressure outside. A gust from the north might force smoke downward, and the flap would be tilted just enough to redirect the airflow. This adjustment required skill, observation, and intuition. Children learned from a young age to notice changes in smoke behavior, to read wind shifts, and to anticipate the necessary movements, skills that could mean life or death. Inside, the floor was layered with insulation. Grasses, reeds, and brush formed the base, over which hides were laid. Air trapped in these layers created additional warmth. The placement of sleeping bodies was strategic. Adults often sat or slept closest to the fire, forming a protective barrier for children or the elderly who were more vulnerable to cold. Sleeping positions were not random, feet toward the center, heads near walls, or huddled in circles to maximize shared warmth. Even minor details mattered. A child's head, turned toward the fire, could retain heat longer, while their extremities might be layered with extra hides. The interior became a microcosm of efficiency, where space, warmth, and energy were balanced carefully. The fire itself was the heartbeat of the tipi. In -30 degrees, fire was life, but it was not used recklessly. A large flame consumed oxygen too quickly, created drafts, and wasted fuel. A small, steady burn of embers was preferred. Firewood was selected with precision. Dense, dry woods produced long-lasting heat with minimal smoke. In treeless areas, dried animal dung became essential, a fuel that burned steadily, produced minimal sparks, and preserved energy over hours. Fire was tended with almost meditative care. It was watched constantly, coaxed gently, and treated as a living partner rather than a tool. Everyone in the tipi understood its rhythms, and children learned the behavior of fire as instinctively as they learned to walk. Moisture control was equally crucial. Breath, sweat, or snow that penetrated hides could freeze and rob warmth. Clothes were layered to keep the skin dry, and any wet garments were dried near the fire without coming too close, preventing melting and refreezing cycles. Even breathing was managed carefully. Inhaling frigid air directly could damage lungs, so faces were partially covered, allowing breath to warm before entering the body. These practices were not arbitrary. They were the result of countless winters in which observation and adaptation saved lives repeatedly. Mobility added another layer of security. Unlike stationary structures, the tipi could be dismantled and moved within an hour if storms approached or resources were depleted. Poles, hides, and household items were arranged for transport, often dragged on sleds or travois pulled by dogs. This mobility ensured that survival did not depend singly on a single location. People could follow game, avoid storms, or seek shelter in more protected terrain. The design of the tipi allowed movement without sacrificing warmth, demonstrating a profound understanding of environmental adaptation. Inside the tipi, time took on a rhythm dictated by cold. Daily routines were deliberate. Tasks like tending fire, preparing food, repairing tools, and checking insulation were sequenced to conserve energy and minimize exposure. Meals were simple, high-calorie, and warming. Pemmican broths and fatty meat provided fuel for bodies constantly generating heat. Every action, from walking to speaking, was considered in terms of energy conservation. Even laughter and storytelling were subtle tools of psychological warmth, easing stress and reinforcing cooperation. Family and social structures were woven directly into the use of space. Elders were placed strategically to monitor the fire and entrances. Adults performed labor tasks while keeping an eye on children. Sleeping arrangements reflected hierarchy not in dominance, but in vulnerability and energy efficiency. Cooperation was embedded into the physical design of the space, so that survival was a collective for as much as an individual responsibility. Even spiritual life intertwined with the practical. Smoke rising from the fire was a conduit for prayers and offerings. Objects and sacred items were positioned intentionally within the tipi, reflecting values, beliefs, and a deep understanding of natural cycles. These practices provided psychological resilience, framing survival as part of a larger harmony rather than a random struggle against nature. Mental stability in the extreme cold was as critical as warmth, and the tipi supported both. Storms tested every element of the system. Snow piled against the hides, wind forced adjustments in flaps, and temperatures could plunge even further. But the tipi flexed, absorbed, and protected. It became a partner in life rather than a passive shelter. Families knew the signs of approaching blizzards, prepared bedding, extra fuel, and even repositioned their structure if needed. Every storm reinforced the lessons of observation, flexibility, and unity. By integrating structure, materials, fire, family, clothing, mobility, and ritual, the tipi was not just a home, it was a system for survival in extreme cold. Every element supported the others, creating an environment in which life was not just possible, but sustainable. At -30 degrees, humans could sleep, eat, work, and raise children safely. The tepi turned what might have seemed impossible into a manageable, even harmonious, reality. In the frozen plains, surrounded by white silence and relentless wind, the tipi stood as a testament to human ingenuity. It demonstrated that survival in extreme conditions was not about brute force, but about observation, adaptation, respect for nature, and the careful orchestration of materials, knowledge, and behavior. Inside its walls, families thrived where others would falter. Outside, the cold raged, but within, warmth, safety, and life endured. The tipi was not merely a shelter, it was a milieu system, a teacher, and a guardian, proving that thoughtful design and experience could conquer even the most unforgiving winters. The fire inside the tipi was more than a source of warmth. It was the pulse of life, the steady rhythm around which every activity revolved. In temperatures plunging to -30 degrees, fire was survival itself, a thin line between life and the unrelenting cold outside. The act of building, maintaining, and understanding fire was a skill passed from generation to generation, honed over countless winters in which every ember mattered. It was not a simple task, nor was it something taken lightly. The fire demanded attention, intuition, and respect, because a mismanaged flame could threaten life almost as severely as the cold itself. The foundation of the fire was the fuel, chosen with deliberate care. Dry wood was rare in frozen plains, and every piece was precious. Dense hardwoods, such as oak or ash, were available, burned slowly, producing long-lasting heat without excessive smoke. When trees were scarce, the dried dung of buffalo or other large animals was collected and prepared as a substitute fuel. Though unconventional to outsiders, it burned steadily, provided warmth, and produced minimal smoke, making it invaluable. Each piece of fuel was inspected before burning. Moisture, rot, or brittleness could disrupt combustion and waste energy. Fuel conservation was not just practical, it was essential for survival. The arrangement of the fire inside the tipi followed precise logic. At the center of the structure, where warmth could radiate evenly, a carefully constructed bed of embers was maintained. Flames were kept controlled, not allowed to roar unnecessarily. A large, uncontrolled fire consumed oxygen too quickly, creating drafts and destabilizing the interior temperature. The rising smoke, if not managed properly, could drift down toward the edges of the tipi, chilling occupants rather than warming them. Thus, fires were almost meditative, tended continuously, observed closely, and adjusted patiently to maintain balance. Children learned to read smoke behavior as instinctively as adults, observing subtle changes in color, thickness, and movement as signals that required action. The smoke hole at the top of the tepi was an extraordinary piece of design. It was adjustable, responding to wind direction and fire intensity. Flaps were manipulated to allow smoke to exit without letting precious heat escape. Even a small misalignment could allow a draft to penetrate or smoke to accumulate dangerously. It required constant observation, skill, and an intimate understanding of both weather and fire behavior. The interaction between the fire and the smoke flaps was a living system, one that demanded coordination between knowledge, instinct, and attention. Fire was also central to moisture management. Breath, sweat, or snow tracked into the tepi could rapidly accumulate and freeze, reducing warmth. The fire's heat was used not only for comfort but to dry wet hides, clothing, and bedding slowly and evenly. Items were never placed too close, or the outer layer could scorch. They were positioned at calculated distances where warmth and airflow would remove moisture safely. Even the embers were strategically rotated, ensuring steady heat without hot spots or cold corners. Cooking, another essential function of fire, was an exercise in precision and economy. Food needed to be heated sufficiently to sustain life, but fuel conservation remained paramount. Stews, broths, and rendered fats were preferred because they maximized energy output relative to fuel used. Bones were cracked to extract marrow, and dried meats were softened near embers rather than directly in flames to prevent overcooking. Even water was heated carefully, just enough to prevent freezing and facilitate consumption without wasting fuel. Every task connected directly to survival, making the fire a hub of both physical and logistical activity. Safety and vigilance were constant. Embers could escape onto dry hides, and sparks carried through smoke openings could ignite the structure. Every flame was watched, every ember positioned carefully. Children were trained early to respect the fire, understanding both its life-giving warmth and its destructive potential. Mistakes could be fatal. Fire management, therefore, was as much about discipline and awareness as it was about skill. Fire also regulated social and family structures. Its position dictated sleeping arrangements, activity zones, and even movement within the tipi. The closest positions to the fire were reserved for those most vulnerable to cold: infants, the elderly, or the sick. Adults alternated duties, tending fire, preparing food, or adjusting hides, in rotations that ensured no one overexerted or cooled excessively. Even play and conversation were orchestrated around the fire, as excess movement could drain energy or disrupt carefully managed warmth. Storms transformed the fire into an even more critical element. Snow and wind outside made movement dangerous. Inside, embers had to maintain heat for extended periods, often through long, dark hours with no opportunity to gather additional fuel. Strategies included banking embers, insulating them with ashes, and controlling airflow to ensure maximum heat retention. Families developed routines for adding fuel incrementally, adjusting for wind direction changes, and balancing interior warmth without overheating or exhausting supplies. Every winter, these routines were tested and refined. The fire was also a teacher. Its behavior signaled changes in weather, subtle shifts in wind, and variations in air pressure. Smoke that moved differently warned of an approaching blizzard, or a sudden temperature drop. Flames that burned inconsistently indicated damp wood or insufficient airflow. These subtle cues allowed inhabitants to respond proactively, adjusting insulation, clothing, or position in the tepi to maintain safety. Children learned to observe these cues as part of daily life, embedding survival knowledge into instinct. Even the psychological dimension of fire was critical. In darkness and cold, the fire provided focus, comfort, and continuity. The glow illuminated faces, reinforced social cohesion, and framed daily routines. It transformed the interior from a frozen chamber into a safe, predictable space. Mental stability in extreme cold was as essential as physical warmth. Panic, stress, or hasty decisions could quickly sap energy, reduce circulation, and increase vulnerability. Fire maintained both heat and calm, shaping not just survival, but the rhythm of life itself. At night, the fire's placement became central to sleep arrangements. Adults often slept near embers to maintain warmth, while children were nestled within the protective zones of fur layers and body heat. Fire was managed so that it burned steadily through the night, requiring minimal intervention but maximum efficiency. Smoke holes were adjusted carefully to prevent chilling drafts, and embers were banked to preserve heat. Even the placement of cooking vessels or fuel stacks was part of a larger strategy to keep the interior environment stable. Sleep was survival, and fire was the tool that made it possible. The fire's integration with clothing, shelter, and movement was seamless. Warmth radiated outward, interacting with hides and furs to maintain a controlled microclimate. Moisture expelled by breath and perspiration was absorbed and redirected by airflow. Sleeping bodies retained heat while protecting each other from drafts. Every element reinforced the others. This integration was not learned from instruction. It was absorbed through practice, observation, and repetition, becoming instinctual over time. European settlers and travelers often marveled at the fire, misunderstanding its subtlety. They assumed larger flames equaled better warmth, but in reality, efficiency, control, and interaction with the tipi structure mattered far more. A small, steady fire, tended skillfully, could outmatch a large, uncontrolled blaze in energy retention, comfort, and safety. This understanding of heat as a resource, rather than a simple output, reflected the sophistication of Native American winter survival. In the end, the fire was a partner, a guide, and a life source. It was physical warmth, psychological support, a signal system, and a teacher of environmental awareness. Without it, clothing, shelter, and knowledge alone could not sustain life at -30 degrees. With it, the tipi became a living system, capable of supporting human life in one of the harshest climates on Earth. Every ember mattered, every adjustment counted, and every observation contributed to survival. The fire was the heartbeat of the winter home, steady, responsive, and essential, a lesson in patience, observation, and the delicate balance between humanity and the frozen world outside. Cold in the plains was relentless, but clothing was the first line of defense. Living at -30 degrees required a profound understanding of how the body interacted with the environment, and the clothing systems developed by Native Americans reflected centuries of trial, observation, and adaptation. Unlike modern insulated jackets or synthetic layers, every element of winter clothing was chosen from natural materials, cut and assembled to maximize warmth, mobility, and durability. Each garment, fur, and accessory played a vital role in survival, forming a system that worked seamlessly with the tipi fire and daily routines. Animal hides were the cornerstone of winter clothing. Buffalo hides, with their dense hair and tough leather, provided insulation, wind resistance, and durability. Deer, elk, and caribou furs were also utilized, often layered to create air pockets that trapped warmth while allowing moisture to escape. Clothing was designed not merely to cover the body but to manage heat, prevent frostbite, and preserve energy. Every seam, every stitch, every flap served a function. The interior surface of the fur faced the skin to trap heat, while the outer layer faced outward, breaking the wind and shedding snow. The design was both simple and extraordinarily effective, honed through generations of observation and adaptation. Layering was a central principle. Multiple garments allowed inhabitants to regulate body temperature carefully, adding or removing layers in response to activity level or environmental conditions. A base layer of soft, dry hide or fur prevented direct contact with the skin, reducing moisture accumulation from sweat. Middle layers provided insulation, often constructed their furs with a dense undercoat. Outer layers were tougher, longer, and treated to repel wind and snow. Layering was flexible, adaptive, and deeply integrated with daily routines. It was as much an art as a science, requiring awareness of materials, activity, and the ever-changing weather outside. Accessories were equally critical. Mittens, boots, and head coverings were crafted to protect the extremities, which lost heat more rapidly than the core. Mittens were often stuffed with grass or fur for additional insulation, while boots were layered and sometimes lined with soft fur to prevent frostbite during long periods outdoors. Headgear protected against heat loss from the skull, while neck and face coverings prevented cold air from entering the respiratory system. Even small details, such as the way strings were tied or flaps folded, could influence heat retention. Nothing was trivial. Survival demanded attention to every aspect of clothing. The interaction between clothing and fire was continuous. Items dampened by sweat or snow were rotated near embers to dry slowly without direct exposure to flames. Fire provided warmth, but clothing extended it, creating a buffer that allowed inhabitants to perform tasks without losing body heat. The positioning of garments in relation to the fire and bedding was deliberate. Wet hides were never allowed to contact sleeping spaces without drying first, as frozen moisture could sap warmth and increase frostbite risk. Observing how clothing absorbed and retained heat was a skill passed from elders to children, often without instruction, absorbed instead through mimicry and participation in daily routines. Movement was another critical factor. Clothing had to allow for activity, hunting, gathering, traveling, and repairing shelters without hindrance. The design of mittens, boots, and layered garments balanced protection with flexibility. Mobility was as crucial as insulation, because overexertion or restricted movement could lead to sweating, which then froze, draining energy and increasing risk of hypothermia. Even sitting near the fire required awareness. Proximity to heat could dry moisture too quickly, creating stiff, uncomfortable garments that lost insulation properties. Every movement, every task, had to be executed with awareness of how clothing interacted with heat, air, and moisture. Children were taught clothing practices early. They learned to dress themselves in layers appropriate for activity and weather, to protect extremities, and to observe subtle cues of cold exposure. Frostbite, hypothermia, and fatigue were ever-present threats, so understanding clothing was not merely habit, it was instinct. Play became a form of practice, mimicking adult movements and learning through trial, observation, and gentle correction. Skills were internalized long before they were consciously explained, ensuring that survival knowledge was deeply ingrained. Storms tested clothing systems rigorously. Snow and wind could penetrate unprepared layers, and temperatures could fluctuate rapidly, dropping to dangerous lows within hours. Clothing had to be adaptable. Outer layers were added when storms approached. Boots and mittens were reinforced with additional fur, and coverings for the face and neck were adjusted to prevent windburn or frostbite. Even sleeping arrangements were influenced by clothing. Those near the fire might remove outer layers to prevent overheating, while those on the periphery remained fully insulated. Clothing became a dynamic system, responding constantly to environmental conditions. Repair and maintenance were ongoing responsibilities. Tears, wear, and frozen seams had to be fixed immediately to maintain insulation. Sinew, bone needles, and spare hides were always available for repair. A single flaw in clothing could compromise warmth, and small errors were magnified in extreme cold. Maintaining garments was a constant task, integrated into daily life, ensuring that every layer continued to function effectively under harsh conditions. Psychological factors also played a role. Knowing that clothing was reliable reduced anxiety, allowing the mind to focus on other survival tasks. Clothing was more than protection, it was confidence, a form of mental armor against the relentless cold. Children and adults alike gained assurance from the tactile sensation of fur against skin, the weight of layers that trapped warmth, and the knowledge that every garment had been chosen, constructed, and positioned with care. Mental resilience and physical survival were intertwined through this intimate relationship with clothing. Clothing also supported communal survival. Families coordinated the use and sharing of garments, ensuring that those most vulnerable, infants, the sick, or elders, received the best insulation available. Skills in making, repairing, and adjusting garments were passed along within the community, creating a culture of interdependence and shared knowledge. Survival was never an individual endeavor. It was a collaborative system in which clothing was a central, unifying component. Even simple actions, like standing in wind, walking across snow, or tending fire, became exercises in understanding clothing dynamics. Breath condensed on fabric, layers shifted during movement, and insulation needed constant adjustment. Awareness of clothing's interaction with both body and environment was continuous, intuitive, and unconscious. A misjudgment could result in frostbite or energy loss, reinforcing the constant vigilance required for life at -30 degrees. The integration of clothing, shelter, fire, and social behavior created a holistic survival system. Each garment enhanced the efficiency of the tipi, allowing its walls and fire to retain warmth more effectively. Clothing extended mobility, enabling hunting, travel, and repair work in extreme conditions. Layering preserved energy, minimized risk, and coordinated with family routines. Every element reinforced the others, demonstrating a profound understanding of both human physiology and environmental forces. Through careful construction, continuous maintenance, observation, and practice, clothing transformed the harshest winters into livable conditions. It was not merely protection, it was an active participant in survival, a system as complex and responsive as the fire, the tipi, or the family structure itself. Every stitch, layer, and fur reflected knowledge accumulated over generations, ensuring that even in -30 degrees, life was not only possible but sustainable. In the frozen plains, clothing was survival made tangible. It connected body, environment, and community into a seamless system, allowing humans to thrive where others would fail. It was an instrument of resilience, an extension of human adaptability, and a silent guardian against the merciless cold. Through clothing, warmth became reliable, movement became feasible, and life persisted even in a world defined by ice, wind, and relentless frost. Survival at -30 degrees was impossible without a precise understanding of food, nutrition, and energy management. The body's demands were extraordinary in such cold. Every action, walking, tending fire, hunting, or even simply breathing, consumed significantly more calories than in temperate conditions. Without sufficient nutrition, hypothermia and fatigue came quickly, turning small mistakes into life-threatening crises. Native Americans on the plains understood this instinctively, developing diets, preparation techniques, and food storage strategies that sustained energy, warmth, and health through the harshest winters. The cornerstone of winter nutrition was high-calorie, high-fat foods. Fat provides more energy per gram than carbohydrates or protein, and in extreme cold, energy was literally warmth. Meat from buffalo, elk, deer, and smaller game was prioritized not only for protein, but for fat content. Hunters targeted animals with significant fat reserves, understanding that marrow, suet, and organ meats were essential for survival. Bones were never discarded, marrow was extracted carefully, often roasted or boiled, to provide dense nutrition. Even scraps that might seem insignificant were valued as concentrated energy sources. Nothing was wasted, and every morsel contributed to life in a frozen environment. Preparation techniques were critical. Meat was dried, smoked, or rendered into pemmican, a compact mixture of dried meat, fat, and sometimes berries, capable of providing sustained energy for long periods. This preparation ensured that food would last through storms, shortages, and extended hunts. Cooking was strategic. Boiling water and making broths extracted nutrients efficiently without over-consuming fuel. Food was never overcooked, which would destroy calories, nor undercooked, which could lead to illness. Precision and observation in preparation were as vital as the selection of food itself. Hunting strategies were intimately linked to food management. Hunters moved with the environment, tracking game over frozen plains, across snowdrifts, and through forests. Travel in -30 degrees was exhausting, and every step burned calories rapidly. Hunters had to balance effort and reward, ensuring that the energy expended in pursuit of food did not exceed the energy gained. Teamwork, planning, and timing were essential. Knowledge of animal behavior, seasonal patterns, and environmental conditions informed every hunt. Success was not guaranteed, but meticulous preparation increased the probability of survival. Storage and preservation were equally sophisticated. Frozen conditions allowed for natural refrigeration, but it also posed risks. Meat left exposed could freeze too quickly, becoming inedible or excessively tough. Game had to be stored in areas where wind and snow would not compromise its quality. Hanging meat from poles, burying it in snowdrifts, or creating insulated caches allowed food to remain accessible, safe, and nutritious. These storage methods required constant vigilance and careful design, balancing protection from predators, spoilage, and environmental extremes. Cooking fires were fit to maximize efficiency in both warmth and food preparation. The central fire in the tepi served dual purposes, heating the living space and cooking food. Placement of cooking vessels, embers, and fuel was carefully calculated to ensure even heat distribution and minimal waste. Water was heated as needed, never in excess, because carrying and melting snow required energy. The timing of meals was also strategic. Large meals were eaten before periods of activity to provide energy, while lighter meals were consumed during rest periods to maintain warmth without overtaxing digestion. Children participated in food management from an early age. They learned to recognize edible plants, identify safe portions of meat, and assist in preparation. Play often became training, carrying small loads, observing cooking processes, and helping maintain fires. Knowledge was transmitted organically, ensuring that skills were embedded before they were consciously understood. The process created not only competence but confidence, crucial for survival in a world where errors could be fatal. Food intake was closely tied to activity. A person preparing hides, repairing a tipi, or traveling across snowdrifts consumed energy continuously. Calories were timed carefully to match exertion, preventing both fatigue and waste. Hunger was a signal, but not a guide. Understanding the body's response to cold, exertion, and energy expenditure was critical. Even minor miscalculations, eating too early, too late, or too little, could compromise the body's ability to generate heat, putting the individual at risk of hypothermia or frostbite. The social aspect of food was as important as the physical. Meals were shared, communal, and ritualized, reinforcing cooperation and mental stability. Sharing food ensured that those most vulnerable, children, elders, or the sick, received sufficient nutrition. Storytelling, guidance, and instruction occurred around meals, combining nourishment with education and psychological support. The act of eating together strengthened social cohesion, an essential factor for maintaining calm, alertness, and efficiency in harsh conditions. Storms presented additional challenges. Hunting could become impossible, snow could bury stored food, and fuel for cooking could be scarce. Preparation for these periods included stockpiling pemmican, drying meat in advance, and rotating supplies to maintain freshness. Knowledge of how long food could last in frozen caches, how to protect it from moisture, and how to ration during extended storms was passed down meticulously. Families developed contingency strategies that balanced risk and conservation, ensuring survival through periods of scarcity. Food selection was guided by both nutrition and practicality. Berries, roots, and edible plants were gathered where possible, supplementing meat and fat with vitamins and minerals. Even in frozen winter landscapes, hidden caches of plants could provide essential nutrients. Knowledge of seasonal availability, preservation techniques, and safe identification was vital. Misidentification could be fatal, and thus this knowledge was taught carefully, embedded in stories, rituals, and hands-on experience. Hydration was another critical factor. Even in freezing temperatures, the body required water. Snow and ice were melted over embers, but this required careful management. Direct consumption of snow could lower body temperature, so indirect heating was essential. Water also facilitated digestion, allowed pemmican and meat to be consumed efficiently, and maintained cellular function in extreme cold. Every sip was calculated, balancing need with the energy cost of melting ice and maintaining warmth. The cumulative of food strategies extended beyond mere survival. Proper nutrition increased stamina, improved cognitive function, reduced risk of illness, and reinforced social cohesion. Hunger or energy imbalance could lead to rash decisions, slower reactions, and diminished cooperation. In -30 degrees, these consequences were amplified. Food management became a discipline, integrated into every aspect of life: hunting, clothing, movement, and shelter, forming a complex, interdependent survival system. Even the smallest actions were informed by understanding nutrition: the way meat was cut, dried, or stored, the way fat was rendered, the timing of meals, and the rotation of supplies all reflected a deep comprehension of energy, metabolism, and cold weather survival. Each decision was deliberate, precise, and informed by cumulative experience, showing that survival depended as much on knowledge and strategy as on physical strength or bravery. Ultimately, food in the frozen plains was a lifeline, a system, and a form of intelligence. It connected hunters, families, and communities into a continuous observation, preparation, and execution. The interplay between food, fire, clothing, and shelter created a sustainable system in which life could thrive even at -30 degrees. Every bite, every meal, and every preserved cache reflected centuries of adaptation and wisdom, demonstrating that survival in extreme cold was not luck, but the result of deliberate, intelligent practice. The winter table was more than sustenance. It was the center of life, education, and strategy. Children learned to respect the energy it provided, to observe the care in its preparation, and to internalize the lessons of conservation. efficiency, and foresight. Adults coordinated, planned, and executed strategies for long-term survival. Together, through fire, food, clothing, and shelter, families created a resilient system, a living example of human ingenuity meeting environmental extremes. Through mastery of food, Native Americans ensured that even in -30 degrees, their bodies could generate warmth, their minds could function, and their families could remain cohesive. Food was life, energy, strategy, and culture all in one. It exemplified the principle that survival in extreme cold is not about facing nature directly, but understanding it, working with it, and integrating all systems, body, shelter, fire, clothing, and community, into a unified whole. Water is life, and in -30 degrees, water becomes one of the most complex and vital challenges of survival. It exists as ice and snow, deceptively abundant yet difficult to access efficiently. Native Americans on the plains understood that dehydration in extreme cold could be as dangerous as hypothermia, and they developed techniques to secure, manage, and consume water safely while conserving energy and maintaining warmth. Water was never taken for granted, because in frozen landscapes, even the simplest mistakes could have dire consequences. Snow was the primary source of hydration in winter, but consuming it directly was perilous. Eating snow cooled the body internally, drawing heat from vital organs and increasing the risk of hypothermia. It required careful management, often by first melting it near embers or over small fires before consumption. This practice not only preserved body temperature, but also allowed for the efficient use of heat and energy. Large quantities of snow had to be transported carefully from outside, avoiding contamination or waste, ensuring that the effort of collecting it did not exceed the energy it provided. Ice, harvested from rivers or frozen lakes, presented another challenge. While it was denser and more energy-rich than snow, it required careful mutting and purification. Thin ice could break under weight, creating hazards of sudden immersion or injury. Water from lakes or rivers was often placed near the Tipi fire in insulated containers to melt slowly, providing a steady supply for drinking, cooking, and other domestic needs. Containers were crafted from materials that minimized heat loss, often wood, bark, or hollowed gourds, and were positioned to allow embers to radiate warmth without scorching or rapid boiling. The process of melting snow and ice was itself an exercise in energy efficiency. Firewood was precious, so embers were managed to maximize heat transfer. Small quantities of snow were added gradually to water containers, allowing controlled melting without dramatic temperature drops that would waste heat. Water was stirred gently, often using wooden implements, to distribute warmth evenly. Children participated under supervision, learning both the technical and strategic aspects of water management from an early age. The rhythm of melting, pouring, and storing water became second nature, a routine embedded into daily survival practice. Water management extended beyond consumption. Hygiene, cooking, and even snow placement outside the tipi were coordinated to preserve warmth and prevent waste. Washing hands or preparing food required minimal water use, often recycling the same water for multiple tasks. Spills were carefully controlled, as frozen droplets could create slippery hazards or reduce interior warmth if absorbed into bedding or clothing. Even the act of breathing into snow to melt it slightly before collection demonstrated an understanding of energy transfer and conservation. Hydration was closely linked to activity and nutrition. Hunting, walking across snow, or chopping wood increased fluid requirements, while sitting or sleeping reduced them. The body's signals were monitored carefully. Thirst was only one indicator, as extreme cold could dull sensations masking dehydration. Understanding subtle cues, the dryness of lips, the moisture of skin, or the color of urine, allowed inhabitants to maintain hydration without risking heat loss. This knowledge was passed on through observation, mentorship, and repeated practice rather than formal instruction. Storage was another critical aspect. Containers had to prevent freezing, spillage, and contamination while remaining accessible. Water caches were rotated frequently, with fresh snow or ice added to replace melted portions. The flow of water from collection to consumption was deliberate, minimizing energy loss and ensuring a continuous supply. Even the interior placement within the tepi was strategic, too close to the fire, and it boiled unnecessarily, wasting fuel. Too far and it froze, becoming unusable. Managing this balance required skill, observation, and ongoing adjustment. Storms posed additional challenges. Heavy snow, freezing rain, and strong winds made access to external water sources dangerous. Families prepared for these events by stockpiling water in insulated caches, sometimes buried under snow to preserve temperature or placed in sheltered areas to prevent freezing. Knowledge of seasonal changes, wind patterns, and the thermal behavior of snow and ice guided every decision. Preparation allowed survival not just through ordinary days, but through extreme weather events that could last for days or weeks. The psychological component of water management was significant. Confidence in a reliable water supply reduced stress, enabling individuals to focus on other survival tasks. Worry or miscalculation could lead to panic, inefficient movement, or energy waste. Knowledge of when to collect, how to melt, and how to ration provided a sense of control in a world where external conditions were unpredictable and often hostile. Children learned these skills gradually, internalizing the connection between observation, action, and consequence in a frozen landscape. Water also played a role in fire and food systems. Snow and ice were converted into drinking water, cooking water, and sometimes even used to regulate fire temperature or steam foods. This integration required precise timing. Water was melted just in time to prevent loss of heat, coordinated with cooking needs, and rotated for daily consumption. It was a continuous interplay, a living system in which the management of one resource directly influenced the effectiveness of others. Even minor innovations had outsized effects. Using layered hides to insulate water containers slowed freezing dramatically. Positioning containers on elevated surfaces near embers, but not directly in the fire, created a controlled environment that balanced warmth and energy conservation. Snow barriers outside the teepee prevented drifting from burying essential supplies, while the careful channeling of runoff prevented ice formation that could obstruct access. These small, deliberate actions accumulated to make life sustainable in conditions that could easily overwhelm unprepared bodies. Travel also influenced water strategy. Hunters and scouts needed portable supplies, often carrying small insulated containers filled with melted snow or water along sleds or travois. Planning trips around available water sources reduced the energy cost of hauling heavy containers long distances. Water became not just a consumable, but a logistical concern, integrated into broader strategies for mobility, hunting, and survival. The interplay of hydration, energy expenditure, and terrain knowledge demonstrated a holistic understanding of the environment. Health and survival were intimately tied to water. Even minor dehydration could impair cognitive function, coordination, and temperature regulation, all critical in -30-degree conditions. Maintaining hydration allowed hunters to track animals, families to manage fires and cooking, and children to learn skills effectively. Water management reinforced resilience, allowing human systems to function optimally despite extreme cold, wind, and snow. It was a principle life embedded in routine, observation, and experience. The cumulative effect of water strategies extended beyond the individual. Families coordinated collection, storage, and rationing, ensuring that every member had access to sufficient hydration. Elders guided children, teaching subtle signs of dehydration, safe collection techniques, and the importance of conserving energy while melting snow. This knowledge created a cultural continuity, embedding survival skills into daily life and ensuring that even the youngest could thrive in an environment that demanded constant vigilance. Ultimately, water management was an integral part of survival in the plains. It connected directly to fire, food, clothing, and shelter, forming a web of interdependent strategies that allowed life to persist even in one of the harshest climates on Earth. Understanding snow and ice, controlling temperature, storing and rationing efficiently, and integrating hydration with activity and nutrition exemplified a sophisticated and adaptive system. The presence of water was never assumed. It was earned, managed, and respected, reflecting a deep understanding of both human physiology and the environment. In -30-degree winters, water was a silent teacher, revealing the limits of human endurance, the precision of planning required, and the interdependence of all survival systems. Mastery of snow and ice, observation of subtle environmental cues, and careful energy management allowed families to live, travel, and thrive despite relentless cold. It was not just a necessity, it was a skill, a discipline, and a central component of the living, breathing system that was the plains' winter home. Through water, humans learned patience, observation, and coordination. They understood that survival was not about brute force, but about subtlety, timing, and integration. Every sip, every melted snowflake, every carefully insulated container contributed to warmth, energy, and life itself. Water connected fire, food, clothing, and shelter into a cohesive, responsive system, exemplifying the genius of adaptation that allowed Native Americans to endure where others would falter. Survival in -30-degree winters depended not only on shelter, clothing, food, and water, but also on mobility. The plains were vast, harsh, and unpredictable. Storms could arise without warning, snowdrifts could block paths, and game moved constantly. A stationary home was a liability, and the genius of the tipi lay in its portability. Native Americans understood that mobility was survival, and the design of their shelters, the preparation of their belongings, and the organization of daily routines all reflected this principle. Moving a family and their home across frozen plains was not simple, but it was an integrated skill that combined engineering, strategy, and communal effort. The tipi itself was designed for rapid assembly and disassembly. Its wooden poles were strong yet flexible, allowing them to bend under stress without breaking. Poles were bundled, tied, and transported with consideration for weight distribution and ease of handling. Hides were folded carefully, layered to maximize insulation while minimizing bulk, and secured to prevent tearing during transport. The smoke flaps, liners, and bedding were all compacted in ways that preserved their functionality while ensuring portability. Every component was optimized for quick relocation, allowing a family to dismantle, move, and rebuild the structure within an hour if necessary. Planning a move was a deliberate process. Observing weather, tracking game, and assessing snow and ice conditions dictated when and where to relocate. Families maintained an intimate knowledge of their territory, including natural shelters, water sources, and favorable hunting grounds. A sudden blizzard or a depleted local supply of firewood could trigger immediate relocation. Mobility was not random, it was calculated, coordinated, and executed with precision. Each family member had a role, and every movement was synchronized to maintain warmth, preserve resources, and minimize risk. Transporting the tipi and supplies often involved dogs, sleds, or travois. Heavy hides, poles, and food caches were loaded onto sleds, with careful attention to weight distribution. Poles were stacked efficiently, with the longest and strongest at the base to provide stability. Food and water supplies were secured to prevent spillage, freezing, or contamination. Even clothing and bedding were bundled to maintain insulation during transport. The process required both physical strength and logistical skill, as improper packing could compromise efficiency or safety. Children played important roles in mobility. They assisted in carrying smaller loads, managing animals, and observing the sequence of moves. These experiences were educational, teaching them coordination, planning, and environmental awareness. Mobility was not merely a physical task, it was a system of knowledge, passed from one generation to the next. The youngest learned by imitation, observation, and participation, internalizing routines that would later become instinctive. Every action, from lifting a pole to adjusting a sled, was part of a continuous chain of learning. Timing was critical. Moves were often planned around daylight, wind conditions, and temperature fluctuations. Traveling in darkness increased the risk of injury or disorientation, while moving during the coldest part of the day required additional layers and energy management. Wind could make sleds difficult to handle, and deep snow increased resistance. Families adjusted their pace, rotation of effort, and load distribution to optimize both energy expenditure and safety. Even the sequence of tasks, dismantling the tipi, packing supplies, loading sleds, and walking in formation, was refined through experience to maximize efficiency. The social dynamics of mobility reinforced community and cooperation. Each person had a defined role. Elders oversaw planning and navigation, adults managed heavy loads, and children assisted and observed. Coordination ensured that no one fell behind, that resources was conserved, and that safety was maintained. In extreme cold, individual errors could jeopardize the entire group, so cooperation was not optional, it was essential. The act of moving became both a physical challenge and a lesson in teamwork, communication, and shared responsibility. Environmental observation guided every decision during travel. Understanding snow conditions, wind patterns, and terrain allowed families to select the safest, most energy-efficient paths. Deep snowdrifts could hide hazards, such as frozen creeks or thin ice. Wind could redirect sleds or increase frostbite risk on exposed skin. Observing animal tracks helped predict game locations and navigate efficiently. Knowledge of the environment was continuously applied, tested, and refined, reinforcing a deep connection between survival skills and natural intelligence. Even small details could affect mobility. Poles and hides were carried in specific orientations to prevent damage, sleds were balanced to reduce tipping, and animals were managed to maintain pace and avoid exhaustion. Clothing was adjusted to prevent overheating or sweating during exertion, as moisture could freeze and sap body heat. Fire management before and after moves ensured that warmth was maintained during packing, and that embers could be quickly re-established at the new location. The entire process required careful orchestration, linking every element of survival into a single functional system. Moves were often coordinated with hunting and food strategies. Tracking game required positioning the tipi strategically near water sources, shelter, or feeding grounds. Distance, energy expenditure, and weather forecasts influenced the decision of where to relocate. These choices balanced immediate survival needs with long-term sustainability. Families moved to conserve energy, protect resources, and maximize access to critical supplies. Mobility was not an inconvenience, it was a strategic advantage, allowing humans to thrive in an environment that others would find deadly. Storms tested mobility in extreme ways. Blizzards could trap families, snowdrifts could block roads, and visibility could drop to near zero. Preparedness was essential. Sleds were reinforced, supplies were pre-packed, and contingency plans were in place. Families moved deliberately, with careful attention to pace, rotation, and observation. Survival depended not only on physical endurance but on decision-making under pressure. The ability to relocate efficiently, even in chaos, was a defining skill that separated life from death. The act of rebuilding the tipi at a new location was equally sophisticated. Poles were erected in precise order. Hides were arranged to maximize insulation. Smoke flaps were adjusted according to prevailing wind, and bedding was positioned to optimize warmth. Every move made outside influenced interior conditions inside. Families recreated a functional microcosm of warmth, safety, and efficiency, often within an hour. Children learned these sequences, embedding structural knowledge and problem-solving skills alongside physical conditioning. Mobility also reinforced psychological resilience. Knowing that relocation was possible reduced stress and increased confidence. In extreme cold, the sense of control provided by the ability to move, adapt, and re-establish shelter was invaluable. Families maintained a rhythm of preparation, observation, and action, ensuring that mental stability, energy management, and social cohesion were preserved even under relentless environmental pressure. The cumulative effect of mobility, shelter, fire, clothing, water, and food was a holistic survival system. Moving a tipi was not a single event but part of an ongoing, integrated strategy. Each element supported the others, creating flexibility and resilience. Families were not passive observers of the environment. They interacted dynamically with it, adapting, responding, and optimizing continuously. Mobility was both practical and strategic, a testament to human intelligence, ingenuity, and adaptability. Through mastery of movement, Native Americans demonstrated that survival in -30 degrees was not about fighting nature but cooperating with it. Mobility allowed families to follow resources, avoid danger, and maintain efficiency. It reinforced community, coordination, and knowledge transfer. Every relocation was a lesson in energy management, observation, and tactical decision-making. It showed that even in the most hostile conditions, life could not only persist but flourish when humans integrated design, skill, and communal effort into a single, responsive system. The lesson of mobility extends beyond mere movement. It demonstrates the importance of adaptability, planning, and coordination. It shows that survival is a system of interdependent actions, each reinforcing the other. The tipi was not just a portable shelter, it was a tool of strategy, a vessel of knowledge, and a physical manifestation of centuries of adaptation. By moving intelligently, families maintained warmth, health, and access to resources, proving that flexibility is as crucial as strength in extreme winter conditions. In -30-degree winters, survival was as much about human relationships as it was about fire, clothing, or food. The harsh plains demanded cooperation, coordination, and emotional resilience, and the tipi was the central stage where social structures, family dynamics, and community strategies were enacted. Life inside the tipi was tightly interwoven, with every member contributing to warmth, safety, and continuity. The interior was not merely a living space but a microcosm of order, education, and survival, reflecting a delicate balance between hierarchy, responsibility, and communal life. The family was the basic unit of survival. Each member had specific roles dictated by age, ability, and experience. Adults provided physical strength and knowledge, tending fire, preparing food, repairing the tipi, and maintaining weapons and tools. Elders offered guidance, decision-making, and oversight, drawing on experience to anticipate storms, track resources, and plan relocations. Children were apprentices in survival, learning by observing, imitating, and participating in daily tasks. Even seemingly simple actions, adjusting a fire flap, rotating embers, or layering hides, became lessons in precision, strategy, and responsibility. Within the tipi, every movement and decision was an exercise in communal survival. Roles were flexible yet structured. Emergencies demanded rapid coordination, with tasks distributed according to skill and proximity. Hunting expeditions required careful division of labor. Trackers, drivers, and observers each contributed to the success of a hunt. When storms approached, tents were dismantled, supplies packed, and relocation executed with choreographed efficiency. Inside the tipi, these roles were rehearsed daily, reinforced through routine, storytelling, and ritual. Each action had a purpose, and each person understood the consequences of mistakes. The social structure was a living system, constantly adapting to environmental conditions while reinforcing collective responsibility. Communication was critical. The wind howled outside, reducing visibility and complicating movement. But inside the tipi, voices, gestures, and subtle cues conveyed essential information. Elders directed tasks, parents guided children, and siblings coordinated movement and effort. Stories, instructions, and warnings were delivered clearly, efficiently, and often repetitively to ensure comprehension. Even in moments of play or relaxation, children absorbed lessons in observation, timing, and cause and effect. Social communication was inseparable from survival, teaching both practical skills and psychological resilience. Trust and interdependence were central. Families knew that errors could be fatal, whether a poorly stoked fire, a mismanaged supply, or a neglected layer of clothing. This understanding created a culture of mutual accountability. Everyone had to perform their role reliably, not for abstract obedience but for life itself. Children internalized this principle early, learning that cooperation was not optional but essential. Social bonds were reinforced through shared responsibility, collective problem solving, and communal rituals. The tipi became a space where human connection was literally life-giving. Education was embedded in daily life. Observing fire behavior, layering hides, rotating food caches, and adjusting for environmental changes were all practical lessons. Storytelling was equally educational, conveying knowledge about weather patterns, animal behavior, seasonal changes, and cultural traditions. Even myths and rituals contained survival information encoded for memory and transmission. Children learned these lessons organically, ensuring that skills, knowledge, and cultural continuity survived alongside the harsh physical environment. Education was not confined to instruction. It was an immersive, participatory experience. Conflict and discipline were managed carefully. Harsh conditions left little room for disputes or errors, yet human nature persisted. Elders mediated conflicts, enforcing rules and expectations while maintaining psychological balance. Discipline was not punitive but corrective, focused on ensuring that all members adhered to survival principles. Mistakes were addressed promptly with guidance, demonstration, and participation in corrective action. Children learned that rules were inseparable from life-sustaining behavior, internalizing responsibility alongside skill. Social rituals reinforced cohesion. Meals were communal events, not only for nutrition but for bonding, instruction, and emotional stability. Fire management, storytelling, and planning occurred around shared warmth, strengthening communication and reinforcing hierarchy while fostering cooperation. Rituals, prayers, and symbolic actions connected families to nature, instilling respect for the environment and an understanding of its rhythms. These practices reduced stress, provided structure, and reinforced shared identity, crucial in conditions that tested physical and mental endurance daily. The interior of the tipis was carefully organized to support social and survival functions. Sleeping areas were arranged according to vulnerability and role, with children and the elderly positioned to benefit from shared warmth. Work areas were designated near fire or entrance points, facilitating efficiency and safety. Tools, food, and clothing were stored systematically, ensuring rapid access when needed. This spatial organization reflected not just convenience, but a profound understanding of energy flow, environmental management, and communal coordination. The physical layout supported both life and learning. Psychological resilience was reinforced through social structures. In extreme cold, mental fortitude was as critical as physical preparedness. Fear, anxiety, and stress could sap energy, reduce circulation, and impair judgment. Close family bonds, clear roles, and predictable routines provided a framework of stability. Stories, rituals, and shared labor created a sense of continuity and purpose, allowing inhabitants to face harsh conditions without succumbing to panic. The social system was a buffer against environmental and psychological stress, integrating survival with culture and emotional well-being. Mobility, too, was social. Relocating the tipi required coordination, planning, and trust. Every member contributed according to ability, from dismantling poles to carrying hides, managing sleds, and supervising children. Even play became a form of preparation, teaching balance, coordination, and teamwork. The movement of the home across frozen plains was a collective exercise, reinforcing cohesion, skill, and adaptability. Social cohesion was inseparable from practical survival, a lesson learned through constant use in real conditions. Knowledge transfer was another key function. Elders observed, corrected, and guided, embedding expertise into every interaction. Children absorbed these lessons through participation and observation. Mistakes were corrected, successes praised, and strategies rehearsed repeatedly. This continuous cycle of learning ensured that critical skills, environmental awareness, and survival knowledge persisted across generations. Cultural transmission was embedded directly into the social fabric of the tipi, making it both a living space and an educational institution. Even leisure was purposeful. Singing, Storytelling or quiet games served to maintain morale, strengthen social bonds, and reinforce attention to detail. Laughter, humor, and storytelling relieved tension, created emotional resilience, and preserved mental focus. These activities were carefully balanced against the need for energy conservation and warmth, demonstrating an understanding of both physical and psychological dynamics. Inside the tipi was inseparable from survival, blending practicality with culture, education, and cohesion. The interconnectedness of social life with other survival system was continuous. Fire management, food preparation, clothing adjustment, water collection, and mobility were all intertwined with communication, coordination, and observation. Decisions were collective, skills were shared, and each action had both practical and social dimensions. The tipi became a living system where relationships, structure, and environment worked together to sustain life. Social cohesion was not incidental, it was central to survival, amplifying the effectiveness of every other system. In storms, the importance of social structure became even more pronounced. Harsh winds, deep snow, and freezing temperatures demanded immediate action. Families operated as cohesive units, each member performing roles learned and rehearsed over years. Children were not passive, they observed, assisted, and contributed. Elders guided, parents coordinated, and the household functioned like a well-tuned organism. The social structure ensured that everyone remained safe, warm, and nourished even when the external world was violent and unforgiving. Ultimately, social structure in the tipi was as critical as clothing, fire, or food. It created order, reinforced knowledge, and provided emotional resilience. Family dynamics, education, communication, and ritual all contributed to an integrated system of survival. In -30-degree winters, life was demanding, unforgiving, and complex, but the cohesion of human relationships turned challenge into stability, danger into preparation, and hardship into shared accomplishment. Through careful orchestration of social roles, cooperation, and communal learning, Native Americans transformed the interior of the tipi into a microcosm of life, culture, and survival strategy. Every action, every interaction, and every ritual reinforced the principle that survival was not an individual endeavor, but a collective enterprise. Inside the tipi, warmth, knowledge, and cohesion combined to create an environment where life thrived against extreme odds, demonstrating that humans endure not only through technology and skill, but through collaboration, observation, and shared purpose. Childhood in -30-degree winters was an education in survival from the very beginning. Unlike temperate climates where children could explore with minimal risk, the frozen plains demanded that every action, observation, and movement was purposeful, building skills essential for life. From the moment they could walk, children were immersed in the routines of the tipi, learning through participation, observation, and repetition. Life was simultaneously rigorous, structured, and subtly playful, blending necessity with cultural transmission. Every day was a lesson in patience, observation, and adaptation, designed to prepare the young for the relentless demands of winter survival. Learning began with observation. Even before a child could participate in tasks, they watched adults perform essential survival routines, tending the fire, arranging hides, collecting snow and ice for water, preparing food, and adjusting clothing. Every movement was precise, deliberate, and meaningful. Children noticed how embers were rotated, how smoke flaps were adjusted, how hides were layered for maximum warmth. They learned to anticipate changes in wind, temperature, and snow conditions simply by watching those with experience. Observation was not passive, it was the first stage of skill acquisition, embedding environmental awareness into instinct. Participation followed observation. Toddlers might carry small bundles of firewood, fetch tools, or assist in arranging hides. Each task was carefully chosen to match physical ability while teaching essential principles. Even the simplest tasks reinforced discipline, coordination, and awareness of risk. Children learnings an effect firsthand. Moving too close to embers could result in burns. Improper stacking of hides reduced warmth, and mishandling tools could damage essential supplies. These experiences taught